The most dangerous legends are the ones people mistake for ordinary old men. The laughter echoed across the Marine Corps parade ground long before anyone realized the afternoon was about to become unforgettable. Bright Carolina sunlight reflected from polished vehicles lined beside the training area, while a warm coastal breeze carried the distant rhythm of helicopter rotors across the base. Young Marines moved confidently between obstacle courses, equipment stations, and rows of neatly organized gear, their conversations filled with energy and ambition. Standing quietly near the edge of the restricted training area was an elderly man who looked completely out of place. Walter Hayes, 84 years old, wore faded blue jeans, worn leather boots, and an old olive field jacket whose fabric had softened after decades of faithful use. A weathered baseball cap shaded his pale blue eyes as he calmly watched the American flag wave above headquarters. He stood with the relaxed posture of someone who had learned long ago that confidence never needed to be announced. Corporal Ethan Brooks noticed him immediately. At 24 years old, Brooks carried himself with the unmistakable confidence of a Marine who believed discipline, modern training, and visible rank explained everything worth knowing. Several younger Marines naturally gathered around him as he walked toward the elderly visitor with an amused smile. "Sir," Brooks called loudly enough for nearby Marines to hear, "are you looking for the museum?" A few chuckles spread through the group. Walter slowly turned his head toward the young Marine. His expression remained calm, almost thoughtful. "No," he answered quietly. "I am exactly where I need to be." The answer drew even more laughter. Brooks folded his arms and took another step closer. "This is an active training area. Visitors usually stay on the other side of the fence." Walter nodded politely. "I know." Brooks tilted his head. "Then who are you waiting for?" Walter glanced briefly toward the headquarters building before answering. "Someone expecting me." The simple reply only encouraged more smiles among the gathered Marines. Brooks looked around as if inviting everyone to enjoy the moment with him. "Well, while you are waiting, maybe you can satisfy our curiosity." He paused dramatically before asking, "What was your call sign?" The surrounding conversations gradually faded. Even Marines walking past slowed slightly, curious to hear the old man's answer. Walter remained completely still. The breeze lifted the collar of his faded jacket, while the steady hum of aircraft engines drifted across the installation. For several long seconds, he said nothing at all. Brooks smirked, believing the silence confirmed that the elderly visitor had invented his military past. Finally, Walter looked directly into the young Marine's eyes. His voice remained calm, steady, and almost impossible to read. "Old Bear." Silence lasted less than a heartbeat before laughter returned louder than before. Brooks shook his head with an easy grin. "Old Bear? That sounds more like a hunting nickname than a Marine call sign." Several Marines laughed with him. Walter offered no explanation. He did not defend himself. He did not argue. He simply looked once more toward the headquarters building, as though the conversation had already ended. 50 yards away, Staff Sergeant Ryan Cole froze in the middle of reviewing a training checklist. His eyes lifted slowly toward the elderly veteran. The words he had just overheard awakened a memory buried deep inside a historical leadership briefing years earlier. He could not remember the operation. He could not remember the date. But he remembered one thing with perfect clarity. The room had gone completely silent when that call sign appeared on the screen. Ryan slowly lowered the clipboard in his hands, never taking his eyes off Walter Hayes. Around him the laughter continued, but it no longer sounded harmless. Somewhere inside headquarters, a story everyone believed had ended decades ago was quietly waiting to begin again. The laughter slowly drifted back into ordinary conversations, but Staff Sergeant Ryan Cole no longer heard any of it. His attention remained fixed on Walter Hayes, who stood quietly beneath the afternoon sun as though nothing unusual had happened. Most people reacted when they became the target of mockery. Some defended themselves. Others walked away. Walter didn't either. He simply watched the American flag moving gently above the headquarters building while the coastal breeze brushed against the collar of his faded field jacket. There was no frustration in his face, no embarrassment, and certainly no desire to prove anything. Corporal Ethan Brooks mistook that silence for defeat. He looked around at the younger Marines gathering nearby and smiled confidently. "See," he said, "anybody can invent an impressive-sounding nickname." Several Marines laughed again. One private joked that he wanted his own call sign to be Thunder Hawk. Another answered that he preferred Iron Wolf. The small group quickly turned the moment into friendly entertainment, but Walter never joined them. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on the parade ground where young recruits crossed in steady formation, their synchronized footsteps echoing softly across the concrete. For a brief moment his expression softened, almost as though the familiar cadence carried memories too old to explain. Brooks noticed the distant look and stepped closer. "You still have not told us who invited you here." Walter slowly turned toward him. "Someone who remembers promises." Brooks frowned before laughing again. "That sounds mysterious." Walter simply nodded once. Sometimes the simplest answers do. The response only deepened Brooks's confidence that the elderly visitor was telling stories. He folded his arms and shook his head with an amused smile. "Well, whoever invited you is taking a long time." Walter looked toward headquarters again. "He will come." There was no uncertainty in his voice. No hope. Only quiet certainty. Ryan noticed that detail immediately. People pretending usually added more information than necessary. Walter did the opposite. Every answer remained short, calm, and completely free of exaggeration. Ryan searched his memory once more. Years earlier, he had attended a leadership seminar inside Quantico where instructors discussed famous operational decisions without revealing classified details. Most of the presentation had faded from memory, but one image suddenly became clearer. A faded slide showing a list of historical radio identifiers. The room had become noticeably quieter when one instructor paused beside a single entry. Old Bear. Ryan still could not remember the operation connected to it, but he remembered the instructor saying that some names carried responsibilities far greater than recognition. That forgotten sentence suddenly returned with uncomfortable clarity. Without drawing attention to himself, Ryan stepped away from the group and rested one hand on the secure radio clipped to his vest. He hesitated. If his memory was wrong, he would be wasting everyone's time. If it was right, ignoring it could become a mistake he would regret for years. He glanced back toward Walter Hayes. The elderly veteran had not moved. He stood peacefully beneath the bright Carolina sky, listening to the distant sound of helicopter rotors crossing above the coastline. The corners of his mouth lifted into the faintest smile, almost as though the familiar rhythm reminded him of another lifetime. Ryan finally made his decision. He quietly pressed the transmit button and lowered his voice. "Operations, this is Staff Sergeant Ryan Cole. I need a historical verification on a call sign." As the radio emitted a brief burst of static, Brooks continued smiling at the Marines around him, completely unaware that a single quiet question had just begun moving through the chain of command, carrying with it a name that history had never completely forgotten. Ryan Cole stepped farther away from the gathering of Marines until the steady conversations behind him became little more than distant background noise. He kept his eyes on Walter Hayes while waiting for the response from operations. The elderly veteran had not moved an inch. He remained quietly watching the headquarters building with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding that important things rarely happened in a hurry. The afternoon breeze rolled across the parade ground, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and aviation fuel, while a pair of helicopters crossed the distant coastline with their familiar rhythmic pulse. Ryan pressed the radio closer to his shoulder. Static crackled for several seconds before a calm voice answered. "Operations receiving." "Go ahead, Staff Sergeant." Ryan spoke carefully. "I need a historical verification on a call sign. The identifier is Old Bear." Silence followed. It lasted only 3 seconds, but to Ryan it felt much longer. Finally, the operator replied, "Stand by." Ryan lowered the radio and looked back toward the training area. Corporal Ethan Brooks continued entertaining the younger Marines, clearly convinced the entire encounter had already become an amusing story for the afternoon. Walter remained completely unaffected. His weathered hands rested comfortably inside the pockets of his faded olive jacket as he quietly observed a group of recruits crossing the obstacle course. Their synchronized cadence echoed across the installation, and for the briefest moment Walter smiled almost imperceptibly, as though hearing a familiar rhythm carried across decades. Ryan found himself studying the old veteran more carefully. Nothing about him suggested someone trying to impress anyone. His boots showed years of honest wear. His jacket carried small signs of careful repair instead of replacement. Even the faded baseball cap looked as though it had traveled thousands of miles without ever becoming a symbol of status. Ryan realized something else. Walter never once mentioned medals, rank, decorations, or accomplishments. Every answer had been shorter than the question asked. The radio suddenly came alive again. Staff Sergeant Cole. Go ahead. No active records under that identifier. Ryan nodded slowly, although he had expected that answer. Can you search historical archives? Another pause followed. Historical archives require command authorization. Ryan hesitated for only a moment. Please submit the request. The operator sounded uncertain. Reason? Ryan glanced toward Walter once more. The old veteran slowly lifted his eyes toward the American flag above headquarters. The sunlight caught the edge of the fabric as it snapped gently in the wind. There was no anxiety in Walter's face. No expectation. Only quiet certainty. Ryan answered softly. Professional judgment. The operator remained silent before responding. Stand by again. Several minutes passed. Brooks eventually noticed Ryan standing alone with the radio and walked toward him wearing the same confident grin. You are still chasing ghost stories? He asked. Ryan slipped the radio back onto his vest. Maybe. Brooks laughed. You are giving that old man too much credit. Ryan looked directly at him. Or not enough. Brooks shrugged and returned to the others, unconcerned. Before Ryan could say another word, the radio vibrated sharply against his shoulder. This time the operator's voice sounded noticeably different. The casual tone had disappeared. Staff Sergeant Cole, Historical Archives acknowledged your request. Ryan straightened instinctively. Copy. One archived reference has been located. Ryan's heartbeat slowed rather than quickened. Can you identify it? The operator inhaled quietly before answering. Negative. The file transferred immediately beyond our access level. Ryan frowned. Who requested the transfer? Another brief silence followed. Headquarters command. Ryan slowly lowered the radio. Across the parade ground, Walter Hayes continued standing peacefully beneath the bright Carolina sky, completely unaware that somewhere inside the headquarters building, a forgotten file bearing a single call sign had just been opened for the first time in many years, and the chain of command was beginning to pay very close attention. Inside the headquarters building, what had begun as a simple verification request quietly changed direction. A records specialist opened a secure archive that had not been accessed in years. The screen displayed only a handful of historical references before one entry immediately transferred to a higher authorization level. The specialist frowned, picked up a secure telephone, and spoke in a voice noticeably more careful than before. Across the hall, a lieutenant colonel ended a planning meeting without explanation after receiving a brief notification on his tablet. He looked toward the operations center, then walked quickly through the corridor while several officers exchanged puzzled glances. Outside, none of the Marines gathered around Walter. Hayes had any idea that a forgotten name had begun moving through the chain of command. The afternoon training schedule continued without interruption. Recruits crossed the obstacle course. Instructors called cadence. Maintenance crews worked beside parked aircraft. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary except for Staff Sergeant Ryan Cole, whose attention never drifted far from the elderly veteran. Corporal Ethan Brooks noticed Ryan's unusual silence and laughed lightly. Still waiting for history to answer the phone? Ryan looked toward him with a calm expression. History already answered. Someone important is listening now. Brooks smiled as though the comment were another joke. You are giving one old man a lot of attention. Walter quietly watched the parade ground without reacting. A gentle breeze lifted the edge of his weathered jacket while sunlight reflected across the windows of headquarters. He seemed more interested in watching a platoon of young Marines complete a marching drill than in the conversation surrounding him. Their synchronized footsteps echoed across the concrete, and Walter listened carefully, almost as if measuring the rhythm against memories only he could hear. Brooks stepped closer once again. You know, he said with an amused grin, if you really had served with a famous call sign, somebody here would recognize it. Walter slowly turned toward him. Eventually, the single word carried no challenge, no pride, and no impatience. It sounded less like confidence and more like simple certainty. Ryan noticed Brooks hesitate for the first time. It lasted barely a second before the young corporal shrugged and looked away. At that exact moment, Ryan's radio vibrated again. He stepped aside before answering. Staff Sergeant Cole. The voice on the other end spoke quietly. Historical archives confirm the identifier exists. Ryan remained perfectly still. Can you provide details? Negative. The complete file is restricted above our access level. Who requested the restriction? Another brief pause followed. The archive was automatically forwarded to Headquarters Command and flagged for immediate executive review. Ryan felt a chill. Despite the warm afternoon air, automatic executive review was reserved for matters considered historically significant or operationally sensitive. Before he could ask another question, the operator added one final sentence. Staff Sergeant, maintain visual contact with the individual until further instructions. The transmission ended. Ryan slowly lowered the radio and looked across the parade ground. Walter Hayes had not moved. His calm posture remained unchanged, his eyes resting on the headquarters building as though he already knew exactly what was happening behind its walls. For the briefest instant, the distant thump of helicopter rotors drifted across the base. Walter closed his eyes, and a memory flickered through his mind like sunlight through trees. Thick morning mist. The steady whisper of jungle leaves. A radio crackling softly before a calm voice answered with quiet confidence. Old Bear copies. The memory disappeared as quickly as it came. Walter opened his eyes again and looked toward the road leading from headquarters. Ryan followed his gaze. Nothing had arrived yet, but somehow both men seemed to understand that the waiting was almost over. While only a few feet away, Corporal Ethan Brooks still believed the afternoon belonged to laughter rather than history. Inside headquarters, the atmosphere changed one careful step at a time. No alarms sounded. No voices were raised. A secure archive opened behind multiple authorization screens before an aging service record finally appeared. The first page contained almost no information that ordinary personnel could access. The second page immediately disappeared as the system elevated the file to executive review. A duty officer quietly picked up a secure telephone and spoke only a few sentences before transferring the call again. Within moments, another office requested confirmation. Then another. The same call sign continued moving upward through the chain of command, without anyone attempting to explain it over an unsecured line. Outside, the afternoon remained peaceful. Young Marines crossed the parade ground carrying training equipment while instructors prepared the next exercise. The distant sound of helicopter rotors blended with the steady rhythm of marching cadence, creating the familiar heartbeat of a Marine installation. Walter Hayes stood exactly where he had been since arriving, his weathered hands resting comfortably inside the pockets of his faded olive jacket. He watched the movement across the base with quiet appreciation, occasionally smiling as recruits encouraged one another through the obstacle course. Nothing about his expression suggested impatience. Corporal Ethan Brooks glanced toward him again and laughed softly. Looks like your friend is still running late. Walter answered without taking his eyes from the training field. Some responsibilities cannot be rushed. Brooks shook his head with an amused smile. You really believe somebody important remembers you? Walter looked toward him for only a moment. I believe people remember their promises. Ryan Cole listened carefully. The sentence was simple, yet it carried the unmistakable confidence of someone who had never needed recognition to validate his past. Before Ryan could respond, the secure radio on his shoulder vibrated once more. He stepped several yards away before answering. Staff Sergeant Cole. The voice that greeted him no longer belonged to the operations clerk. It was calm, older, and noticeably more formal. This is Headquarters Command. Confirm the individual remains on site. Ryan instinctively straightened his posture. Confirmed, sir. He has not left the parade ground. A brief silence followed. Maintain visual contact. Do not inconvenience him. Senior leadership has been notified. Ryan blinked once. Copy. The transmission ended immediately. Ryan lowered the radio slowly, replaying the unusual wording in his mind. Not detain him. Not question him. Not identify him. The instruction had been clear. Do not inconvenience him. That alone told Ryan more than any classified file could. He looked across the concrete toward Walter Hayes, who quietly lifted his face as another coastal breeze stirred the American flag above headquarters. The sunlight reflected across the windows of the command building, and for the briefest instant Walter's eyes followed the light as though recognizing something familiar. Somewhere deep within his memory, another afternoon returned. A younger voice over a field radio calmly reporting positions. the steady pulse of helicopter blades overhead, the quiet confidence that came from experienced people working together without unnecessary words. The memory faded before it fully formed, leaving only the familiar rhythm of rotors lingering in his thoughts. Walter smiled faintly before returning his attention to the present. Across the parade ground, Brooks still believed the encounter had become nothing more than a harmless joke, but several younger Marines had stopped laughing. They had begun noticing Ryan's unusual composure and the repeated radio traffic surrounding a man who appeared to be an ordinary elderly visitor. Then, far beyond the headquarters entrance, the first Black Command vehicle rolled slowly onto the boulevard leading toward the parade ground. It traveled without flashing lights or unnecessary speed, followed moments later by a second identical vehicle. Ryan noticed them immediately. Walter noticed them a heartbeat later. Neither man said a single word, but both understood that the waiting was almost over, while Brooks remained completely unaware that the quiet certainty standing before him had already reached the highest levels of the base. The two Black Command vehicles rolled slowly across the boulevard with quiet precision, drawing curious glances from everyone on the parade ground. There were no flashing lights, no hurried escorts, and no dramatic announcements. Their calm approach somehow made the moment feel even more important. Conversations gradually faded as Marines instinctively looked toward the arriving convoy. Corporal Ethan Brooks folded his arms and watched with casual curiosity. "Looks like Command has another inspection," he said with an easy smile. None of the younger Marines answered this time. Even they could sense that the atmosphere had changed. Staff Sergeant Ryan Cole remained completely silent, his attention fixed on the lead vehicle as it came to a smooth stop near the headquarters entrance instead of driving directly toward the training area. Several senior officers stepped outside the building and quietly gathered near the sidewalk. They spoke briefly among themselves before turning toward the elderly man still standing peacefully near the edge of the parade ground. Walter Hayes had not moved. His weathered boots remained planted exactly where they had been since arriving earlier that afternoon. The warm coastal breeze stirred the faded fabric of his olive-field jacket, while sunlight reflected softly across the worn brim of his baseball cap. He watched the approaching activity with calm patience, showing no surprise whatsoever. Ryan noticed that detail immediately. Walter was not waiting with hope. He was waiting with certainty. Brooks glanced from the officers back to Walter and laughed softly. "Well, maybe they are finally coming to help you find the visitor center." Walter looked at him with gentle eyes and answered in the same quiet voice that had never changed throughout the afternoon. "No, they are coming because someone remembered." The sentence lingered in the air. Brooks smiled uncertainly, but did not respond as quickly as before. Something about Walter's unwavering confidence had begun to unsettle him, even if he could not explain why. A light breeze carried the distant sound of helicopter rotors across the base once again. Walter slowly lifted his eyes toward the horizon, and for a single heartbeat another memory quietly surfaced. Morning fog drifting between tall trees. Moist air carrying the scent of earth after rain. A field radio resting in steady hands. Calm voices exchanging brief reports without panic or hesitation. Somewhere beyond the trees, rotor blades echoed through the valley, while one familiar voice spoke clearly through the radio. "Old Bear copies. Continue as planned." The memory dissolved almost as quickly as it appeared, leaving Walter standing peacefully beneath the bright Carolina sky. Across the road, the rear door of the lead command vehicle opened. Every Marine watching the scene instinctively straightened. Lieutenant General Marcus Donovan stepped onto the pavement with measured confidence, adjusting his service cap before looking across the parade ground. Several colonels and command staff followed behind him, yet none attempted to walk beside him. The general paused only briefly. His eyes searched the gathering until they found Walter Hayes. He did not acknowledge anyone else first. Ryan felt his heartbeat slow as realization settled over him. Brooks noticed the direction of the general's gaze and quietly shifted his weight, suddenly unsure why one of the highest-ranking officers on the installation appeared interested in an elderly visitor wearing faded jeans and an old field jacket. Without saying a single word, Lieutenant General Donovan began walking across the wide stretch of concrete. Every deliberate step seemed to quiet the base even further. The sound of boots striking the pavement echoed through the still afternoon air, while every pair of eyes followed his approach. Walter remained exactly where he was, calm and composed, waiting with the same quiet patience that had carried him through the entire afternoon. Ryan understood that the next few moments would change not only Brooks's understanding of the old veteran, but the memory of everyone fortunate enough to witness what true respect looked like when history quietly stepped back into the present. Lieutenant General Marcus Donovan crossed the parade ground with calm, deliberate steps that carried the quiet authority of a lifetime in uniform. Behind him, several colonels, command sergeants major, and senior officers followed at a respectful distance, allowing the general to approach alone. The ordinary sounds of the installation seemed to fade into the background. The steady cadence from the training field softened. The distant helicopter rotors blended with the gentle coastal wind. Even the conversations among the Marines slowly disappeared as every eye followed the unexpected scene unfolding before them. Walter Hayes remained exactly where he had stood since arriving that afternoon. His weathered boots rested firmly on the concrete, and his faded olive field jacket moved gently with the breeze. He watched the approaching general with quiet composure, showing neither surprise nor excitement. It was the expression of a man who had long ago learned that recognition was never the reason to serve. Corporal Ethan Brooks shifted uneasily. Only minutes earlier, he had been completely certain that the elderly visitor was nothing more than a harmless storyteller. Now one of the highest-ranking officers on the installation was walking directly toward him without acknowledging anyone else first. Brooks glanced toward Staff Sergeant Ryan Cole, searching for an explanation. Ryan simply stood at attention, his expression calm but deeply respectful. He already understood that the moment belonged to history rather than to any individual standing on the parade ground. Lieutenant General Donovan stopped a few feet from Walter. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. The general studied the familiar, weathered face before him, comparing the living man with photographs preserved inside historical archives and leadership briefings studied throughout his career. Walter met his gaze with the faintest smile. "You still walk too fast," Walter said quietly. The unexpected remark caught Brooks completely off guard. Instead of appearing offended, the general smiled with genuine warmth. "I finally made it, sir," he answered softly. "That is what matters." The surrounding officers lowered their eyes respectfully, understanding the significance of the exchange even without knowing every detail behind it. Walter nodded once. "Good to see you." Those four simple words carried decades of shared tradition, respect, and memory. Without another sentence, Lieutenant General Donovan slowly removed his service cover and held it beneath one arm. The entire parade ground became perfectly still. Every Marine instinctively watched what happened next. The general stood perfectly upright and rendered a precise Marine salute directly to Walter Hayes. No announcement preceded it. No explanation accompanied it. It was simply an unmistakable act of respect freely given. Brooks felt every confident assumption vanish at once. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Around him, officers immediately followed the general's example. Ryan raised his hand without hesitation. One by one, Marines across the training area recognized the significance of the moment and stood at attention, returning the same quiet respect. Walter looked across the line of raised hands for several peaceful seconds. His pale blue eyes reflected gratitude rather than pride. Slowly and with measured dignity, he returned the salute. The afternoon sunlight illuminated the American flag above headquarters while the breeze carried its steady movement across the bright Carolina sky. Walter lowered his hand first. "Thank you," he said simply. Donovan answered without lowering his respectful posture. "No, sir. Thank you." Brooks lowered his eyes, realizing that the quiet elderly man he had laughed at had never tried to defend himself because he had never needed to. Walter had allowed his character to speak where words never could. Ryan looked across the gathered Marines and understood that every person standing there had just witnessed something far more powerful than a display of rank. They had witnessed the rare moment when genuine honor recognized genuine service, and the silence that followed carried more meaning than any speech could ever express. I can continue the story. Here is part 8 as a reusable draft. Edit for several long moments. No one moved. The salute had ended, but the silence it created remained suspended across the parade ground like something every Marine instinctively understood should not be interrupted. The afternoon breeze continued to carry the steady sound of helicopter rotors from the distant flight line, while the American flag rose and fell gently above headquarters. Lieutenant General Marcus Donovan replaced his service cover beneath one arm, but his posture never lost the respect he had shown from the first moment he approached Walter Hayes. The younger Marines watched with expressions that had changed completely since the afternoon began. Curiosity had become humility. Confidence had become reflection. Corporal Ethan Brooks could not take his eyes off the elderly veteran standing quietly before him. Only an hour earlier, he had measured the old man by his appearance. Now he realized that the calm confidence he had mistaken for weakness had actually come from a lifetime that needed no introduction. Lieutenant General Donovan finally turned toward the gathered Marines. His voice remained calm, carrying easily across the open concrete without ever sounding like a speech. "Most of you have never heard that call sign," he said. "That is exactly how it was meant to be. Some names were never created for recognition. They existed because people trusted the voice behind them." Every Marine listened without speaking. Donovan continued, "The man standing before you helped shape the standards that many of us study today, even if we never learned his name in a classroom. His decisions, his discipline, and his example influenced generations that came after him. That legacy belongs to the Marine Corps, but it began with one Marine who never asked anyone to remember him." Walter lowered his eyes slightly, almost uncomfortable with the attention. "General," he said quietly, "there were many good Marines." Donovan smiled respectfully. "Yes, sir. There always were. That is exactly why the best among them always speak about everyone else first." A few quiet smiles appeared among the senior officers. Ryan Cole understood immediately why those words carried so much weight. The humility standing before them was the strongest proof that every historical record had been telling the truth. Donovan looked back toward the younger Marines. Technology changes. Equipment changes. Training evolves. Character does not. Every generation inherits that responsibility from the one before it. Brooks felt those words settle heavily in his mind. He remembered every joke he had made only a short time earlier and wished he could take each one back. Walter seemed to notice the young corporal's expression. He stepped forward only a single pace, closing the distance without creating discomfort. "Corpo." The afternoon slowly settled into evening as the last golden lights stretched across the parade ground, turning every long shadow into a quiet reminder that another day of service was drawing to a close. The ordinary rhythm of the base gradually returned. Instructors resumed training with calm voices, recruits crossed the drill field in organized formation, and maintenance crews continued preparing aircraft for tomorrow's missions. Yet every Marine who had witnessed the remarkable encounter carried the same thoughtful silence. Corporal Ethan Brooks stood motionless for several seconds before finally taking a slow step toward Walter Hayes. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier had disappeared completely. In its place was genuine humility. He stopped a respectful distance away and looked directly at the elderly veteran. "Sir," he said quietly, "I judged you before I knew anything about you. I was wrong." Walter looked at the young Marine with the same gentle expression he had worn throughout the afternoon. There was no disappointment in his eyes, no desire to make the apology last longer than necessary. He simply smiled. "You learned," he answered softly. "That matters more than being wrong." Brooks lowered his head briefly before looking up again. "I will remember today for the rest of my career." Walter nodded. Then today was worth something. Staff Sergeant Ryan Cole quietly observed the exchange from only a few steps away. He realized that the greatest lesson had never come from the classified archives, the forgotten call sign, or even the arrival of the general. It came from the remarkable grace of a man who had every reason to demand respect, yet chose kindness instead. Lieutenant General Marcus Donovan stepped forward one final time. "Sir," he said, "the Marine Corps is grateful that you accepted our invitation." Walter smiled faintly. "I came because someone remembered a promise." Donovan returned the smile. "And we intend to keep remembering." Walter reached up and adjusted the brim of his faded baseball cap before looking once more across the training grounds. Young Marines were already returning to their routines, unaware that their ordinary afternoon had quietly become part of a story that would be repeated for years. He watched them for several peaceful moments before speaking one last time. "Every generation believes it is writing the first chapter," he said. The truth is that every generation is simply trusted with the next page. No one answered immediately. There was nothing left to add. The words settled naturally into the quiet evening air. Walter extended his hand toward Brooks. The young corporal accepted it with both hands, his expression filled with gratitude instead of pride. The handshake lasted only a moment, yet it carried more meaning than any ceremony could have offered. Walter then shook Ryan's hand as well. "Thank you for asking one more question," he said. Ryan smiled modestly. "Thank you for giving me a reason to ask it." Lieutenant General Donovan stepped aside as Walter began walking slowly toward the visitor parking area. No escort surrounded him. None was necessary. As he passed, Marines standing nearby instinctively moved aside, creating a clear path without receiving a single order. Several quietly raised respectful salutes. Walter acknowledged each one with a gentle nod, never slowing his steady pace. He reached his pickup truck, opened the driver's side door, and paused for one final glance toward the American flag waving above headquarters. The evening breeze lifted the flag proudly against the fading sky while the last rays of sunlight reflected across the buildings of the base. Walter tipped the brim of his cap almost imperceptibly before climbing into the truck. As the vehicle disappeared beyond the oak trees lining the entrance road, Brooks continued watching until it was no longer visible. Long after the sound of the engine had faded, the lesson remained. Uniforms eventually change. Ranks eventually retire. Even famous names are sometimes forgotten. But quiet character, humble service, and genuine honor continue inspiring others long after the people who carried them have walked away. Some call signs fade from official records, but the example behind them can guide generations forever.